The GT4 RS is the ultimate mid-engined Porsche, but how different is it to the GT4? In this video, we're going to find out. Today we're at Donington Park Circuit with RMA Track Days doing setups on customer cars, this GT4 RS being one of them, so we thought it'd be a great opportunity to have a look under the skin of this car and show you the differences between the GT4 and the GT4 RS. There are the obvious differences, such as the GT4 RS having the GT3 engine, producing 79 more brake horsepower. There's also differences in the aero and also with weight reductions on the chassis as well. In this video though, we're going to be taking that closer look at the suspension systems. So we're going to take the wheels off and have a little closer look at the main differences between the GT4 and the GT4 RS. So you might be wondering why, even though this is an RS model and it is more track focused than a GT4, why is it still on our ramp getting a setup for track settings? And that is because, just like our GT4, it still is held back as standard with not enough camber and not enough settings on the car to get the best out of it on the circuit. So we'd still see the same things. The outside edge of the tyre has been scrubbed and it'll be worn much faster than the rest of the tyre out on track due to that understeer scrubbing through the front end. The RS does have the front shock assembly from the 991.2 GT3 and GT3 RS with the hydraulic nose lift on there as well. So it is uprated and it is also much stiffer sprung, which we'll get onto a little bit later in the video. But even with all of this equipment on the car, the settings that are physically put on the car for sale are still held back quite a lot. So all the adjustment is still there, as it was in our GT4, so we can get much better settings on this car as standard. Taking a look at the brakes, one of the biggest differences when you opt for the steel, so this is on ceramics that we've got here, but when you have the steel option, there are 408mm disc, which is 28mm larger than the steel disc that comes with the GT4. So there's a lot more braking force there from the 4RS than you see from the GT4. If you have the ceramic spec, then they are 410mm, so 2mm bigger than the steels. But what these do come with is much more advanced brake cooling, similar to what you see on the GT3 RS's, the 991 generation, where they have the ducts in the bonnet, and then that ducts through the bonnet, through some rubber ducts in, and out here into the back of the disc assembly. So it's blowing that cool air, clean airflow from the front of the car, being turned through these ducts straight onto the back of the disc. So much more advanced brake cooling than we see on the GT4. We've not personally noticed too much brake fade as of yet, but our car is spec'd with the ceramics. With the steel discs, there is more fade apparent, so this ducting would really help, especially on the car's specs with the steel rotors. Another major difference on the front suspension assembly is obviously the center locking wheels. So on our car, you've got the 5 bolts that hold a wheel on like normal. When you come over to the RS model, they take after the 991 GT3 and RS's much more closely, where they have the center locking wheel nut. So this is actually technically better for track use because once locked, it can't come back undone due to the safety mechanism here in the middle of the nut. The biggest downside to these is the amount of torque required to actually tighten and loosen these nuts. So you do need 600 Newton meters of torque to tighten these or loosen them using either a very large torque wrench or an advanced gun that you can get as well that unlocks and locks these safely too. Biggest issue with that is if you have issues with your tyres on the day or need to change a wheel, it's not as simple as popping down to your local tyre garage. They need to have the equipment set up so you can get these on and off. So there is a bit of a drawback in the terms of serviceability of getting your wheels on and off with ease, but in terms of actual usage, these are a much better thing for the track because they don't respond to heat, so they don't crack themselves back off like a normal wheel nut could do, so they're a bit better for that service. One of the biggest differences felt between the 4RS and the GT4 is the spring rates that they come out of the factory with. So the GT4 out the factory is a 45 Newton meter front spring and an 80 Newton meter rear, whereas the GT4 RS is a 100 Newton meter front spring and 140 Newton meter rear. So the front is more than double the GT4 as standard, and the rear is nearly double the rear as standard on the GT4. So a huge increase in chassis stiffness and cornering stiffness on the GT4 RS models. The dampers have obviously been replaced over the GT4 ones to handle that level of spring, because if you go that stiff on a stock spring, on a stock shock on the GT4, you would struggle to control the rebound of the spring with it being so stiff. So everything is revalved on this car to handle that spring rate, but it's a lot stiffer than standard. The chassis also sits 30mm lower than a standard GT4 out the factory, which means we have a much lower centre of gravity, and all the kinematics have been re-engineered to compensate for that. So we haven't moved the roll centres out of whack by doing that. It comes out the factory 30mm lower with all the roll centres in the corrected position as well, which is a really nice feature. We're going to be going lower than that using the adjustment in the shock, but on the 4 GT4 RS, the front ride height is actually very limited. We can only go 10 millimeters further down, and then we hit the stops on the nose lift, and we can't go any lower, which for track use isn't really low enough. It's perfect for road use and a little bit of track, but if you're just tracking your GT4 RS, we want to go a little bit lower than that. So with that in mind, we have actually engineered a full kinematics kit for the GT4 RS chassis, which we have now finished developing and testing. So we will be bringing some stuff your way on that soon as well. But what we've done in that kit is we've increased stiffness very slightly on the springs to get a better distribution of the chassis front to rear. And then we've also allowed the car to go even lower as the springs are shorter by a fixed amount, so we can get a different range of height adjustment, so we can go lower again for the chassis and get somewhere nearer where our GT4 is currently, because our GT4 is a lot lower than what this will be set to in a second with the lower ride height on max low as standard. So with the kinematics kit fitted, you get the stiffer spring rate, you get the lower ride height, and then we've also corrected the dampers again, so at the lower height you've got the correct bump to droop ratio in that damper, very similar to what's fitted to our car, as we know the benefits to get out of this chassis. In terms of ride height, the GT4 is extremely responsive to ride height changes. We know we can have the bump steer issues when we go too low, and we correct that with the bump steer tire at end. But in terms of ride height and the dynamics, if you get the rake angle perfect in the GT4 and the GT4 RS chassis, it really gets the sweet spot in terms of understeer and oversteer balance, and also braking stability and turning stability. If you get the rake angle perfect, you get the right loading on the tire, and you also get a really nice stable rear end. So they're very, very susceptible to rake angle and ride height changes. So it's a really important focus point when you're setting these cars up. One of the limitations of going as low as we did with our GT4 is obviously front ride height in general on the roads and making clearances, so we have it set perfectly for track, but it is quite low out on the roads. We do still drive ours on the road, but we know it is quite low for general clearances, speed bumps, things like that. The beauty of the GT4 RS is that it comes with the axle lift on the front, so you can go even lower. You can have that nice low ride height for track use, but then when you're going on the roads, you do have the nose lift to correct the ride height to get over things that might be in your way. So that's quite a nice feature on this car to allow you to go more aggressive for track use, but still have it nice and friendly on the roads and clear things that you would need to clear to save your front splitter. So that's quite a nice touch. Another major change on the fundamentals of the suspension is the front axle is actually 6 millimeters wider in track width, and the rear axle is 8 millimeters wider in track width. So it sounds like a very small amount, but track width makes a huge effect on cornering stability and load transfer. So there's an equation for lateral load transfer, which boils down to the lateral load through the car, so the G-force through the car, the height of the center of gravity, and also the track width of the car. And the bigger the track width of the car, the less the lateral load transfer for the same amount of G. So effectively, if we increase track width and we go through a corner pulling 1G of force, we'll reduce the amount of load transferred as a percentage by the amount of the track width. So the bigger the track width, the less percentage of mass is transferred to the outside tyres through the corner with the wider the track we go. So that means we get more stability, less roll physically in the chassis. So it means we get a much more stable and flat platform through the corner just by increasing our track width slightly as well. So it's a really nice feature to do without going too wide, because then you have no roll and no feel and you just push through the tyres. So there's a fine balance to achieve, but more track width does give more cornering stability as well. So along with the stiffer springs, the track width will really help to keep the car really nice and flat and planted through the corners. So a nice feature on the 4RS compared to the GT4. This is also 22 kilos lighter than the GT4. So this has been achieved with quite a lot of different components being very slightly lightened to achieve the overall weight loss of 22 kilos. That's a carbon fiber hood and roof, which isn't on the GT4. It's also got no headlight cleaning system, so that adds a little bit of weight with the motors in there. They got rid of that as well. They've got lighter weight carpets and door panels, and they've also got rid of the engine bay cover in the back as well. So it's a lot louder in that cabin, but in the aid of saving weight, all of those things had to go. So they've got it a little bit lighter than the GT4. We're going to be looking into lightening our car as well, but first we actually need to add a little bit of weight in by way of a cage. We know we need that cage in there soon because we're pushing so hard on the track. Just for the safety factors of having a cage in a car, we need to look at getting the cage fitted to ours quite soon. So that's going to add a little bit of weight. After that, we need to then weigh the car, and we're going to look at some weight reduction techniques to get as much mass out of our GT4 as well. In terms of aero on the 4RS, it actually has 25% more downforce than the GT4 as well, and that's with the redesigned rear wing and also the increased depth of the front splitter. So we're going to be looking at incorporating some additional aero upgrades on our car as well, because we know it could benefit from even more downforce just to help really push through that compound and generate even more traction. The front splitter is something we're going to be looking a lot into as well, because we like getting a lot of nose on the car, and the rear is fairly easy to achieve with either wing risers or an uprated rear wing, but the front splitter is something we're going to look into to really get that front end to keep the balance the same as well. We don't want to upset the rear too much with too much rear downforce, or the front too much with too much front downforce in comparison to the rear. So we're going to be looking at that later down the line of just getting that balance perfect by increasing both the front and rear aspects of the aero downforce. Moving to the back of the car, there's also some differences compared to the GT4 as well. So one thing that's completely different to the GT4 standard is the rear axle out the factory has 0.25 degrees more negative camber than the GT4 does as well. We're going to be increasing this even further as we've done our development with the chassis on the GT4 and the 4RS now, and we know that it needs more rear camber from standard, especially for track use, as we're just not using all of that tyre. Obviously on our videos you'll have seen the inside edge was red hot, which suggests there is enough camber if not too much. However, we now know that that is actually due to the exhaust routing, which in here we can see runs right behind the rear edge of that tyre. So that's heating that compound up on the inside edge, and it's actually changing the data so it looks like it's camber related, but it's actually not. So that's something we're going to be looking into more on our car, on how to manage that and mitigate it. But on this car, that is something we are ignoring on that very inside strip, because we know now that is due to the exhaust temperatures not letting the compound cool and keeping it hot, as opposed to the camber actually causing that. So we need more rear camber on the back axle just to help with the rear stability through the high-speed corners to get that contact patch to lean onto. It's even more important on this car in particular to increase the negative camber front and rear due to that stiffer spring. When you fit a stiffer spring to a car, you're actually going to use more tyre, as the whole chassis is physically going to pitch over onto the tyre compound. Rather than moving around inside the wheelbase and using camber gain and free suspension movement, you're actually going to be pivoting the chassis harder onto the compound. So you need that negative camber there to match that chassis roll, to use all of the contact patch through that corner and get maximum grip out the chassis. So that's why on the 4RS it's even more important to get the camber front and rear increased over the GT4. And we saw how important it was on the GT4 with the softer springs, never mind on the 4RS with springs as stiff as it has. The rear axle also is fully monoballed compared to the GT4, which has rubber bush in the lower control arm. That again is just to manage the amount of grip that this car is able to produce. Alongside the aero increases, the actual track width increases and the spring rate increases, the rear axle is generating a lot more grip than a standard GT4 would. So we're putting a lot more force through that lower control arm, which if it still had a rubber bush in there, it would cause that rear control arm to flex. This means that through the corner, as that load's being applied and as that suspension arm is flexing, it would actually cause a camber and a toe shift at the rear axle, which means we'd get a slightly unstable feeling at the rear end, and we'd feel that mainly through the high-speed corners as we're really loading that tyre up. We're pushing that lower control arm and we're flexing those settings quite excessively. So that's really important to keep an eye on. And with the monoball, that means that it can't flex anymore. So as we're loading that tyre, the tyre's flexing, but the physical suspension assembly is rigid, so it's not moving anywhere. So the settings that we set on this car now are going to remain there through any speed of corner, high speed, low speed, no matter what force we're putting through. It can't physically flex. So all of that force is going straight through the arm and into the chassis without changing any of those settings. That gives much more stability and a lot more confidence to the driver, as they can trust the chassis because they know exactly what setting is on the car and how it's going to respond to those inputs, rather than waiting to feel how different it's going to feel in the different corners. They know what's underneath them and they can push that a little bit harder. As you can see, the GT4 RS is a very impressive car out of the factory, and it's quite different to the GT4 stock as well. We've actually closed that gap with our GT4 quite considerably with our suspension modifications that we've made to date, and we're going to be making even more very soon. So make sure you subscribe to the channel. We're going to be upgrading our suspension even more as we go along, making it more and more track focused as we try and make it the ultimate track handling Porsche GT4.